in open education and innovation in distance education using educational technologies. Um, so my job at the Institute of Educational Technology is primarily as a researcher. My background is discipline background is in philosophy, but I've been working in educational technology research for just over 15 years or so, and have various different roles, as you can see on this slide. One thing I just want to quickly mention is GoGN. You are very welcome to join GoGN. Anyone can join, and you can follow the link here to check out the website. And just to fill you in on what GoGN is, GoGN is a network which supports doctoral and postdoctoral researchers working in the field of open education. And we also promote equitable approaches to research and to knowledge production. And one of the distinctive things about the network is the way in which we explore openness as a practice and process of research rather than just a kind of protocol for doing research with open data or something like that, or publishing open access. So if that sounds like the kind of thing you might be interested in, you don't have to be a researcher, you can join anyway. But even if you're not interested in joining, you might want to come along and take some of our OER, which has been written to support researchers working in the field of open education, including people who maybe don't do research that often. So that's all there if you fancy it. So for today, I'm going to be drawing on both kind of, if you like, my philosophy background and my work in educational technology. And so for the first, I guess, like 20 minutes or so, I'm going to talk about tensions within the concept of open AI, and partly from a technological point of view and partly from an ideological point of view. Then I figured it might be worth having just like a break of 5 minutes in the middle, which we could use for a bit of conversation, if anyone's got any comments or questions at that point. And then I'm going to go into the second part, which is looking at a specific study where we've been using phenomenography to try and work out what's actually understood in practice by the idea of open AI.
Hello,
Can you mute yourself
hello.
if you're not speaking? Um, so in the previous session, Robin was talking a bit about AI as this behemoth. And I see what she means. In some ways, though, I think we need to be kind of more precise about the different kinds of AI and the different reasons that we might use AI. And sometimes the idea of AI is a bit unhelpful because it's too kind of nebulous. One thing I'd like to start with by drawing your attention to is the experience of using what we use AI to describe as a shorthand, which is sort of generative AI systems which work through a chat interface of some sort. Um, and at one level, we put input into the system, and then something else comes out the other end. And certainly, when you first start using these systems, it can feel a bit like magic, right? You just kind of think this thing up, and then the generative AI system will try and produce it for you. Um, I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm not saying it's always impressive, even. Um, but it's more the nature of the experience because we don't really understand what's happening in between the input and the output that well. And you can think of this in technological terms. This is the kind of black box argument where you see the input, you see the output, you don't really see what happens inside, and that remains mysterious. And there's a level where that's true just about the technology itself. Like people don't necessarily know exactly what's going on inside these kind of neural processing networks. There's a certain amount of randomness and chance, you might say, within there. It's difficult to sort of reconstruct. But there's another dimension to this, which is more, if you like, social. We don't necessarily see the full system. We just see the point of interface. So where does the data go when you enter it into an AI system? Hmm, very difficult to know. Um, where does all the moderation come from to train these systems? Don't know. Very hard to find out. For all the technological requirements, the minerals, the rare earth elements that are used to create these systems, where do they come from? Very difficult to find out. What's the environmental impact of me creating a kind of, graphic to use in my presentation? Difficult to know. These are hand drawn, by the way, just to clarify that. Not by me, but by our artist, Brian Mathers. So I just want to start off with this idea that we don't necessarily kind of have a good overview of these systems that we end up using, and certainly students are using. So a couple of years ago, this kind of combination was considered quite exciting by a lot of people in the open education space, not universally, I must say, and I'll come back to that idea in a second. But the idea that we could sort of use something like ChatGPT to enhance the production of OER or to translate OER, um, or to enhance OER in some ways. This really caught people's imagination, and I'm sure there's people on the call now who are doing something like this combination. Um, and there's some very prominent people in the open education space, people like David Wiley, Stephen Downes, Martin Dugumas, all endorsing AI as the sort of next logical step to widen participation in education. And so this is just really the idea of leveraging machine learning to present new possibilities for how we create and localize educational resources. Um, I'm going to come back to the idea of this extractive model in a second, but I just want to note that that's a kind of, an exciting possibility for a lot of people. I was part of a study a couple of years ago with about 50 academics from around the world, trying to elaborate the kind of positive and negative perceptions of AI amongst researchers, really. And here you can see the list of positive connotations. Um, and they'll be familiar to you, right? They're generally variations on the idea of some sort of efficiency, some sort of personalization, some sort of innovation, some sort of augmentation of human capacity. And in some ways, sometimes you could characterize the way that people think about these technologies as kind of omni-capable, right? Whatever the problem is, AI can, improve that thing. Um, and I'm not saying that that's the case, right? But I'm saying that's the way that a lot of people think and talk about these things. And it's not entirely without merit, right? This is not just kind of completely, utopian thinking. There are genuine pedagogical possibilities. There are genuine efficiencies to be had from these technologies, potentially. And we do need more research on what they look like in practice. Thinking about the negative side, and I think these will also be quite familiar to you as well if you're in the open education space. Um, Many ethical considerations, concerns about academic integrity, the integrity of research environments, undermining human cognition in some way, kind of eliminating human learning from pedagogical process, essentially replicating structural inequalities and biases, and so on. And again, I don't really disagree. These are all real, genuine things to think and be concerned about. Um, what I would note is that there's very little kind of synthesis between the positive and negative sides of this thing. And in some ways, you could say what's really happening is that the AI is a kind of polarizing force in the open education space. And some people are kind of really embracing it. And there are many people who are saying, this is horrifying. We need to get as far away from this stuff as possible. And I think this tension is something that I'm going to return to a couple of times in the first half of this talk. Um, but it's very difficult sometimes to sort of resolve these things. But in a sense, if there's going to be an evolution of open education, which um, can foster and flourish with artificial intelligence, then there needs to be some sort of synthesis. There needs to be some sort of resolution of tensions. And I also wouldn't say that these tensions are kind of in equal balance or something like that. If anything, that I would sort of prescribe an iceberg model here, where yeah, there's this kind of magic technology that might save you some time or do these things for you. But really, it's coming at the cost of all these other things, like algorithmic bias, like surveillance, like the black box of effects hidden from you when you use these things, corporate power, and solutionism, and so on. And these are real concerns, and I don't make light of them at all. And I'm not convinced personally that the positive side of all this stuff justifies all the negatives. Another thing that open education people care about a lot is intellectual property. And in this case, we see. let's call it an extractive model, very common amongst LLMs. And there's probably people on the call who've done this. You can put your name into search engines, and it will tell you how much of your stuff has been used to train an AI model. Um, Zero regard for copyright, not caring about copyright in any way at all. Um, and this is kind of obviously antithetical to the values of open education, especially when we put so much provenance on the idea of intellectual property and protecting intellectual property rights and open licenses giving people control over what happens to their intellectual property. And the way in which AI is being used is just steamrolling all of that and not caring at all. I think there is maybe a kind of alternative, maybe a bit more subversive reading about this, where you could say, well, look, actually, um, in a way, if what comes out of a GPT, and this is something we need more case law on, but if what comes out of a GPT is essentially public domain because it can't be copyrighted, the technicalities of this is something like why can't if an elephant paints a picture with its trunk, why can't it be the copyright holder of the picture? And the answer is, well, it's not an agent in the legal sense. It doesn't have the kind of moral purpose of creating something. And the same would apply to a machine. Anything mechanically created can't be copyrighted. By default, if something can't be copyrighted, it's in the public domain. So you could say, well, what we've got here essentially is a way to launder content from copyrighted status into the public domain. And in a way, anything's fair game for the commons that way. As I say, we need more case law on this, but I would say that there's something kind of paradigm busting about the current use of AI with regards to copyrighted content. I hope they will find some sort of legal basis for saying that it's not okay just to take everything. It's certainly being walked very, very slowly through the courts, you might say. But this is a big concern in the open education space. So at this point, I'd like to ask, what's it all for, right? Why are we doing this? Why is AI this thing that we're being, asked to engage with? Um, One way of answering that is to sort of put it in terms of educational imaginaries. Um, and if you like, this is the sort of ideological space around these things. And I think we have a mix of different ways of looking at this. One way of looking at it would be this kind of utopian idea, which you would associate with the sort of positive qualities that I mentioned earlier, where it's just like, look, we're just trying to make teaching as good as possible. Maybe we're trying to make society as good as possible, and we're going to use this technology in that way. You could say, maybe there's a naivety to that, but maybe you need some utopian thinking occasionally. Um, Maybe it's not even utopian to say, look, you could just have these things running on a basis that's not about venture capitalism making money. I wouldn't call that utopian, but it's an alternative, right? Um, at a more practical level, you might say, well, look, we're just trying to automate the stuff that's making it harder for us to do our jobs as educators and as educational institutions. We're trying to improve a little bit, move with the times. And it's, if you like, it's ideologically kind of lightweight. It's not a big ideology. It's just trying to get a bit better. Um, a kind of extension of that view would be this sort of techno solutionism, where you would say, look, you can just solve anything with technology, right? And so, and this is certainly what a lot of Silicon Valley would have you believe. Um, Robin mentioned neoliberalism in the previous talk, and there's a bit of that here, right? It's a kind of market driven approach in a lot of ways. Um, they might not think of that as ideological. I would argue that it is an ideological approach. And then the more extreme side of this would be something like cyber libertarianism, where the whole idea is to kind of radically change society into a new form through AI technologies and so on, and Bitcoin or something like that. Um, Not very common in the open education space, maybe a bit more common in technology companies, and the people who have a lot of influence over what's going on. I would also say, like, if you extend some of this surveillance capitalism, it becomes quite dystopian. And I think that's motivating a lot of the fears that people have around these sorts of technologies. And then, we have this kind of catastrophic interpretation, which is just like, this is basically just destroying society and the environment and social relations and so on. Um, and this is just a kind of big mess of ideas that's going around, if you like, in the different debates with this stuff. Um, but one of the distinctive things about AI technology is that you can use it to influence debates, right? Because you can use it to comment online and create images and propagandize and micro-target people and all this kind of stuff. So not only is AI this kind of contested ideological space, but it's also a technology which further muddies the waters around public debate and in the public sphere. Just quickly to mention, if you're into this idea of kind of ideologies of AI and particularly metaphors of AI, we published a special issue of Jime last year on this theme. And so there's a whole bunch of papers around these different metaphors of AI. Check it out on the Jime website. So you've got all these different bits of science pointing in different directions. You've got these various different ideologies, but it doesn't really feel like you're getting much of a choice, right? Because whether you like it or not, AI is happening, and maybe this is the behemoth that Robin mentioned. Um, it feels like the choice you've got is really just kind of how fast would you like to adopt this dystopian technology, quickly or slowly, because the people who are kind of in the control room for a lot of this stuff, they just want to go quicker all the time, and no matter what the problem is, they want to go quicker. They just need more data, more compute, and so on. Um, it's very difficult to sort of stand in the way of that. Um, and so there's this challenge to open educators. How do we form a constructive response to this? Is the answer just to stop, just to resist? Going back to my black box example, one way that you can interpret the right response from an open point of view is to say, look, we need to make these systems open. And what that means is make them transparent, make them explicable in some way, make it so that we can see inside of them and understand what's happening to sort of empower ourselves and to develop our own literacies and so on. So one bit of work that I did a couple of years ago was to look at this idea, connecting openness with the idea of explicable AI. And by explicable AI, what I mean is this idea that people put forward, if you say, whatever your problem is with AI, it's because you don't understand it in some way. So we just need to let people understand what this technology is, and that'll all be okay. And my paper basically says that's really not the sufficient condition for this kind of this idea of explicability, because even if you make it transparent and make it so that people can see the algorithms, they can't necessarily interpret them, right? And they don't necessarily make sense of them. They don't have the right kind of literacies for that. So it's not just a matter of transparency. Explicability also requires a kind of literacy and a kind of ability to engage with these things in a way that most people just don't have the ability to, because it's a very specialized form of knowledge. Um, and also, I basically argue that the sort of social side of these things is not really appreciated fully enough, and explicable AI is often thought of as a kind of technical protocol, right? But it's not. Like explicability requires human agency and human ability of interpretation as well. So, taking the company OpenAI, is it open? Well, I wouldn't have said so, right? But it obviously brands itself as open in some way. Absolutely colossal amounts of money floating around this company. I would note that no one's really making any money from AI at the moment. I wonder how long it can go on for. Um, Thinking about AI systems and the extent to which they can be open. And this is an interesting paper from a couple of years ago, Liesenfeld and Dingemans. And what they did was they audited a whole bunch of open source generative AI systems. And what you can see across the top, I appreciate the text is a little bit small. The columns are basically different ways in which an AI system might be considered open. So does it have open data? Does it have open training weights? Has it got documentation? Has it got an API and all these kind of things? And so they rank them, and they sort of show how open different systems might be. What's down the bottom? ChatGPT. And it's not even included as an example of an open system. It's basically there to sort of show the opposite end of the scale. It couldn't be more closed than it is. And people are using ChatGPT in all kinds of, intimate ways, if you like. They're putting all kinds of personal information in there, and we don't know where it's going and so on. I just urge a bit of caution around that. But they call themselves an open company because they're using open source software. So I think here we have an example of open washing. Open washing is the presentation of activity as, open, branded as open, when in fact it's not open or it's very contestable. Um, we've seen this in the open space, a few different sort of permutations of this. It kind of comes around again and again, because openness is a good sell at some level, I guess. Um, but this is a real concern because we don't really have the right language to say when an AI system is open or not, or what meets the threshold for being open. Maybe we don't need just one standard. Maybe we need many, but we lack the language to articulate that, I would say, at the moment. But maybe there are lots of ways in which you could sort of not meet the standard. Maybe that's a better way of putting it. There is an open source definition of AI out at the moment, if that's the kind of thing that interests you, worth checking it out. And so I would note that on the technical side, there is a bit of progress with this stuff, and there is an evolution towards being able to articulate what it might mean in the open education space for an AI system to be open. So I would say generally that um, we need to articulate what this sort of positive concept of openness can be for educational AI. Maybe openness is the process, through which we get there as well. We put the word open in front of all kinds of things, right? Open education, open data, open access, open content, open science, and so on. And you might sort of ask yourself, well, what is it that all these things have in common, right? Is there something they all have in common? Is it more like what the philosopher Wittgenstein would call a sort of family resemblance between different things, but they're not the same thing, doesn't mean the same thing in all these examples. I would sort of invite you to reflect on that. I'd throw some things in like, my concept of openness at least values things like sharing and collective improvement, and it foregrounds transparency and democratization in the use of technology, pluralism and participatory discourse and, equity and ethics and these kinds of things. It's not the same necessarily for everyone. I think also I advance, I guess, a concept of openness, which is quite closely related to critical practice. And I would say openness is a form of critical perspective because you're starting from the point of view that what there is at the status quo is unsatisfactory in some way. It's closed in some way. And we have to ask who's benefiting from it being that way and how could it be changed to make it more open, to reduce barriers. Um, you may have a more or less critical idea about what openness means. But I think this critical perspective thing is very much needed when it comes to AI, when we have this emerging picture. Earlier this year, I was an author on a paper, and in a way, it kind of returns back to this idea of this sort of unresolved tension within open education and AI, excuse me, which is here characterized as a double-edged sword. And on the one hand, you have these incredible possibilities for using when developing OER, for instance, or um, translating and these kind of things. Um, but we haven't really managed to kind of resolve these tensions. I would say that we're still there in a way, the same place we were in a couple of years ago. Maybe we're getting a bit more specific in some of the questions around this stuff. But these tensions are unresolved, I would say, and some of them just require case law to resolve them, right? Around intellectual property, for instance. Um, Different interpretations are possible around this stuff, and I think we're still working out what that kind of synthesis looks like. Um, So right now, I want to just kind of take a pause. I don't know if anyone wants to come in with any questions or comments. Maybe for the next sort of 2 or 3 minutes, maybe 5 minutes, depending on how long we've got left. And Yeah, I can't see the chat right now, so you'll have to just kind of jump in if you wanted to come in with any thoughts or comments.
We got one comment. Will the slides be made available?
They certainly can be made available, yeah, and they're openly licensed.
If anybody has any other questions, you can just go ahead and hop off mute or put them in the chat and I'll
Hey
pass them to
Rob,
Robert.
can you go back like 3 slides back, um, where you talked about maybe two more? Mm-mm. One more. Yeah. Can you talk more about open washing from the lenses of ethics and safety?
Um, yeah. Uh, so one way of avoiding your ethical responsibilities is to say that we just practice openness or something like that. So you would not necessarily audit yourself, right, for whether you're doing the right things. You would say, well, we're just out there, we're expecting everyone to sort of, if you like, tell us what the bugs are, rather than sorting things out first and, if you like, asking for permission rather than forgiveness. But it's the idea that transparency can be a sort of proxy or a replacement for due process with ethics.
Mm. So, like, if open AI were to be open, would that would they be transparent about what? Right? Like we talked about algorithms being so complicated that not everybody
Yeah.
understands that. So how that transparency can be
Well,
like
yeah, that's the point, I guess.
inculcated.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's transparency is not a sufficient condition for ethical. So, but I mean, you're not going to get transparency, right, from these companies
Yeah.
because the way they moderate their algorithms, for instance, is done with vulnerable people in the global south and all that sort of stuff. They're not going to show you that.
And
They're
they
not going
claim
to.
that they don't know it anyway, right? Like
Yeah,
they
that's quite
they
possible.
claim that we don't know how it's created its self-improving system, it's improving itself. And like, so where could transparency really, like what it could look like in future if you imagine, like what is the vision of it?
Yeah, I'm going to come to a bit of that in the second half, but I would just note that we still need transparency. Like transparency is still essential. It's a sort of it's a necessary but insufficient condition for ethical AI. So, and it's also a necessary but insufficient condition for open AI, because making it transparent doesn't make it open because it doesn't necessarily have the values of openness. But you still need it, right? It's still a positive thing to be transparent, but it's not by itself enough.
Yeah.
I'm just aware of time, so I just want to crack on, I think, and carry on into the second half. So mainly I've been talking about these tensions in the first bit. For the second half, I want to talk to you about a study that I was involved with recently, which is looking at trying to articulate in a bit more detail what people understand in practice by OpenAI. So this does kind of follow on a bit from the previous question. Um, So I did this work with a couple of GoGN members. They were the leads on it. I was more the kind of grandfatherly figure at the back, along for the ride. Um, this is the question that we were interested in. What does openness mean when you apply it to AI and in education? And again, you may have kind of, some views around this. Um, Here we have this idea of transparency coming up again, um, removing barriers, things being open source, things being ethical. People have their own language for this stuff, right? And so part of the point of this study was to try and kind of draw these things out in a bit more detail. So it's phenomenographic study. Um, that means basically we interviewed people and we had 24 experts, not just from open education, although they were well represented, also from technology companies, from AI companies. I think we had some lawyers as well. And so we did these interviews with them around their understanding of artificial intelligence. What does it mean to them? Their understanding of openness in the context of open education. How do you understand that? And then putting it all together how do you understand openness within the context of AI in education? And this will show you roughly the process that we followed. So the interviews took place from October 24 to January 25. We went through an extensive coding process written up this year, and I'm going to take you through the results of that process, basically. So most people may come as no surprise to you that most people in the sample agreed that the idea of openness in AI is not just one thing, and it's also very context dependent. It depends on which countries people are in, depends on what legal frameworks they're working in, depends on their educational culture and climate and so on. And that's partly a thing about openness, but it also reflects the diversity of implementation of AI as well. So I'm going to show you first of all the kind of like end result, and then I'm going to take you through a few slides which sort of tell you how you get back to this. But the overall result of this study is that you can understand OpenAI in two aspects. One is the properties of a system. And a system doesn't just mean the technical specifications of a system, but also the sort of socio-technical elements, what human beings are doing and how they're working with that system. So those properties include things like the availability of the system, what you can do with it, whether it's adaptable, the fact that it's not proprietary, that it's transparent, inclusive, and ethical. And the other aspect is around practices. So not really technology, but just kind of what are the human beings doing with that technology. And here you find things like sharing, having a kind of open mindset, being empowered, being able to collaborate. But overall, this sense of kind of the values and what you do with them. Now, within that, we observed a kind of variance across different aspects within those two elements. So that can be the scale in which you're operating. And so you can see an AI system differently depending on whether you're thinking of it just in terms of it being a tool at the point of use. So, you know, the interface with the black box, if you like, through individual and group perspectives. And then there's this more social perspective, which would be something like thinking about the environment, thinking about what's it doing to society, you know, and all these kind of things. You might say that the people who are very pro AI are maybe operating at one element of this, one end of this scale, and the people who are very concerned about AI are operating at the other end of the scale. In a way, they're not wrong. They're just looking at it from a slightly different perspective. Maybe that's, you know, looking for that sort of compatibilist, synthetic sort of position. You can also understand it differently in terms of the granularity about this. You might have a very binary idea about openness. It's either open or it's not, right? Or you might have this more contextual, more kind of blended spectrum kind of idea where it's like, well, it kind of depends. Some things are open in some ways and not in others, and that just, you know, depends on context quite a lot. We also found there's this sort of slight variance between, and it depends a bit on how much people are focused on the technology itself, openness versus open source. And for some people in the tech space, open source just means open just means open source. There's not really much difference between them. And from a more pedagogical perspective, people are bringing in this wider, thicker sense of openness, which is more value laden. And we also found that there are essentially four different orientations that people are kind of falling into. And I'll come back to these at the end, but pragmatic, so it's just, you know, can I use the tool or not? That's what makes it open. It doesn't really matter, right? Sorry, if I can use GPT and it helps me and, you know, whatever, that's open for me. You may not agree, but it seems like a consistent position. Collective, so this would be more like using collaborative approaches to AI, using AI as a kind of boundary object or that kind of thing. A more aspirational attitude, which is sort of saying, look, this is about what we could do in the long term. So this is, again, a thicker sort of ideological idea where you say, look, we're trying to bring about a better society in some way. We're trying to improve education in some way. And that's why we're doing it. That's the only kind of open AI that we're interested in, is whether it helps us do that or not. And then I would characterize the final one as this kind of critical perspective, where this is where the people who are just saying, like, it's just not worth it, right? We don't need any of this technology. It's basically just harmful to society. Essentially, they are open AI skeptics who will just say, look, there is no version of this technology which can be compatible with the values of open education. So that's an overview, right? I know there's quite a lot there to take in. Um, One thing we asked people about was, what's your vision for open education? How do you understand it? And again, you depending on who you ask, you get a different answer to this kind of thing. Some people are much more interested in just the nuts and bolts of teaching, and they don't have this thick ideology about it. Other people have this kind of DEI lens that they're bringing to it, sort of social justice perspective. Neither of them are necessarily wrong. They both can find a home in the open education space, I would argue. Um, but they tend to agree about the actions that they're taking, right? They're all interested in collaborating, they're all interested in sharing, removing barriers, and so on. And they all share common values, right, and approaches around kind of how you do this stuff. And in a way, this starts to help us understand, well, this is what an AI system should support. These are the values, they need to be consistent with the values of open education. Is there room for an extractive model? Maybe not all AI systems have to be extractive in that way. We've heard about local language models. You can certainly imagine systems that are not based on venture capitalism and surveillance capitalism, right? Those are not inevitable features of AI or machine learning. They are just the dominant ones at the moment. I'm going to skip this one just because of time. So we asked people to elucidate their idea about open educational resources, but specifically how openness is understood in the context of OER. And again, this helps us start to try and understand a bit more about kind of what those system features might be like if they are, coterminous with OER's uh, affordances. Yeah, and I will share these slides. Um, We also saw the emergence of this kind of long-standing debate in open education around Libre versus gratis. So this would be whether the important kind of freedom is the permissions that you get from open licenses, for instance. It empowers you to do something in some way, share in some way that you couldn't before, or the idea that actually this is about cost, this is about economics, and openness, open licensing is a way to produce things and share things more cheaply. And that's the, useful thing about OER. That's the important thing about OER. And that's certainly been the basis of a lot of the um, lobbying in the United States of America, for instance, around open textbooks and stuff like that. I mean, that's the sort of starting point for these conversations. Is it's about cost, and then the innovation stuff kind of comes later as a sort of downstream effect. Um, so this tension of efficiencies and cost. I mentioned before this idea of sort of binary versus a full spectrum kind of understanding of openness. And one thing we found is that our participants certainly put the boundaries at different points along the scale, if you like, of what was possible. And for most people, the idea of just like availability, can I access it or not? That's what open means. Most people in our sample didn't accept that view. That was a minority view. But for some people, that's the only thing that really mattered. Everything else, yeah, fine. It doesn't really matter whether it's inclusive or socially just. It just matters whether I can use it or not. Um, I think it falls to proponents of the sort of thicker idea of social justice being part of openness and all that sort of stuff. I think it falls to them to articulate very fully what that means in the context of an AI system. That's not an easy thing to do necessarily, but it doesn't really feel right to me to just say, well, as long as I can use it, that's the thing that matters. I'm all right, Jack. But it's not an unreasonable view, even if you don't agree with it. Let's go skip this one as well because of time. So you have these two senses of openness, these two aspects that I mentioned before, properties and practices. And this is not sort of wildly different to something like OER and OEP, right? Open licensing has certain affordances, certain properties that lets you do certain things. open practices are the things that you can do with those affordances. And this emerged quite organically from the interview data. This wasn't something that we sort of asked people directly. And again, the thing that comes back to in some ways is like it's the values that matter, right? Just to try and kind of show you a bit more of the detail of this quickly, it's a bit much to get all this across. But you can see here on the left-hand side of the screen, these are the properties of AI tools or systems. And on the right-hand side, open practices that you could do with AI systems. And so you have this idea of non-extraction, for instance, the idea of inclusion, availability, adaptability, permissiveness, it being non-proprietary. That's pretty far away from most of the systems that people are using. And again, this idea of transparency, which I've characterized as a sort of necessary but insufficient condition of openness. On the practices side, you've got things like sharing, how we share, doing it in respectful ways. How do we enable people? How do we create the right kind of literacies? How do we remove the right kind of barriers? How do we get the right mindset? How do we collaborate in the right way? When we're using a GPT, for instance, we are collaborating with people in a very weird way, right? There's definitely some other human action somewhere in that training data, but we're not really kind of interacting in a way that makes sense, in the usual common sense of the term interaction. We become extractive in a way, right? We start to extract something from that training data. So there's something very complex there that I find quite interesting personally around, the idea of the commons and how it might be changing. But you come back to this idea of the values of openness and how do we retain those values working with something like an AI system? That's the challenge that we have, going forward. And I'm not saying that, you could solve how to do it from this data or anything like that, but it starts to give us a way to maybe put the right sort of language on it. So to give some concrete examples of what open systems might look like, you have open weight models, for instance. You can run them locally. We're seeing a bit of progress around licensing for things like this Mozilla Common Voice project. But basically, I'll come back to this in a second, but basically having a response to what's going on. Because for quite a long time, it felt like no one really knows what to do because the whole idea of copyright, the whole idea of open licensing is just blown apart by this extractive approach. But then that's starting to happen now. We're starting to be able to articulate that, what it might look like, how data provenance might be made more visible. And similarly, non-extractive systems, what they, how they might be formatted, what they might do and look like, that's emerging at the moment. But I don't think we're quite, there in terms of something that can compete with the big platforms. Thinking about the practices side, so you have things here like, like we're doing today, right? Exchanging perspectives, exchanging thoughts and hopes for these systems. We're seeing more collaboration on big projects around this stuff, and things like enhancing OER rather than just this sort of maybe a bit more limited idea of just let's use ChatGPT to create OERs and that kind of thing. But some more innovative and more creative approaches, and I think we'll see more of that as time goes on. It's so fast moving and it's so difficult to keep up. And if you're someone whose main job is not research and AI, it's basically impossible to keep up with what's going on. So we need to make sure that we have those conversations, that we keep up to date, that we continue to understand what's going on, and that we do it collectively. I think also going back to this idea of literacies, it's tough, right? But we have to be better at understanding what the systems can do and how they work. A lot of people are still a little bit head in the sand maybe about this stuff, and I think you need to engage. It's easier said than done. Just to go back to this idea quickly of binary versus sort of spectrum of openness. One thing that comes out of the study is the idea that the same system might be considered open in some contexts, but not open in others. And that could be sectoral, it could be geographical, it could be a cultural thing. But it's an interesting thing because it means that this idea of openness is itself like not an essence or a universal quality that we can point to. It's really just a feature of a context. That adds complexity, but it could also be a way of kind of trying to solve this because like we don't have to have one final definition. We can have this more what's the word? more protean kind of interpretation, right? It can become different things. And maybe that's the sort of strength and promise of it, rather than the idea of there not being a definition being a problem in some way. So that kind of gives us maybe these different four uh, um, orientations, which maybe you relate to these, maybe you don't. Um, I think personally, there's a bit of a maturity model here. I think people start off their journey in open education often thinking about like, okay, well, I'm just trying to solve some problem. Like my students don't have a textbook or something, right? And then as you get more into it and you get more into the practice side of it, you get more into the innovation side of it, then maybe you start thinking in these bigger terms rather than just is the solution to a problem on a particular day. Um, and so maybe we need to sort of move up through these orientations. Maybe we need to sort of think about how these different levels and understand the interplay between them as well. So that's the overall kind of outcome space of this study. And we're still working on it. We've basically got a draft and we're looking for someone to publish it at the moment. The whole paper is quite long, so I've had to give a pretty quick overview of it today. But if anyone wants to check out a copy, then just drop me a line. Um, just a final thought, because we're nearly at time. This is from a blog post on Creative Commons, published quite recently, Attribution in the Age of AI. And I thought it was interesting because it's kind of moving towards these um, more compatibilist, synthetic sort of positions between these different tensions that I've been talking about. And the authors of this blog post basically say, look, we recognize these tensions between generative AI and open licensing, in this case, Creative Commons licensing. But we're essentially really at the start of the journey with all this stuff, and the systems can change and improve. And I think this is the right way to think about it. It doesn't mean you have to blindly accept everything that comes our way that's called AI. But there is the potential there to solve some of the issues that people have. So, for instance, being able to give attribution for what comes in out of a GPT. And in a way, this is kind of undermining the black box, right? This is making things more transparent. This is saying, look, we can tell you where this stuff came from. There's no reason why this system can't do that. It's just complex. Um, there was also active research being done around attribution systems and how to do that more effectively with AI. We also see more regulatory pressure on AI developers. It's a bit late in the day, maybe, right? They've been allowed sort of free reign for a long time, but things are starting to change and things are starting to move the other way. And part of that is because the people who are ultimately using systems, they want certain things from them and they don't want slop, right? They want to be able to check the provenance of the things that they are using in their education and their research. So I think things are starting to move in that direction. We're not really there yet, right? So mainly I've just been telling you all about the tensions and kind of the difficulties with this stuff. I hope you find it useful. I hope that it kind of helps you think more clearly about some of it. But the positive message here, I guess, is that things are starting to move back the other way. It's not just a kind of a horror story from start to finish. And there is room in this space for people to do good work around AI, but it requires us to engage, basically. So thanks for listening.
All right, thank you, Robert. Throw some reactions in the chat or in Zoom. Give Robert his love. Thank you. That was really great. There were a bunch of questions in the chat, but maybe
Yep.
I'm just going to put your LinkedIn in the chat. So if people have something specific that they want to ask to you, some people were asking about some of those graphics that you made. But we will be putting the chat on our resource site for this institute. But yeah, thank you, Robert, again for your time
My
and
pleasure.
and information. So everybody, we are going to be moving on to our next breakout session. If you want to join the lobby, the link is there. And we will see you all in the next one.
Thanks, everyone.